Today we bring breaking updates on the rising tensions between the United States and Ukraine, following a major setback in peace negotiations involving the ongoing war with Russia. U.S. President Donald Trump has once again launched fierce public criticism against Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, accusing him of obstructing critical diplomatic progress. This follows a sudden and dramatic withdrawal by the U.S. delegation from a high-stakes peace summit scheduled in London, which had been announced as a potentially decisive moment for the conflict. The absence of Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was a direct response to Ukraine's refusal to accept the most recent American peace proposal. Among the controversial elements, Washington had suggested formally recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea, an area annexed by Moscow in 2014, but internationally recognized as Ukrainian. President Trump, visibly frustrated, declared that Zelensky's stance was damaging the prospects for peace, claiming that Ukraine risked losing everything unless it accepted the terms on the table. Trump stated that Ukraine's refusal could result in the complete collapse of Western support in the coming years. In return, President Zelensky reaffirmed his government's commitment to Ukraine's constitutional principles and sovereignty. He appealed to the continued support of Western allies, emphasizing unity and mutual effort in these trying times. However, he also made clear that under the Ukrainian constitution, no president has the authority to hand over national territory, including Crimea. This, according to Zelensky, made the American proposal impossible to accept. Despite these public reassurances, tensions are running high in Kyiv. Ukrainian officials fear that Trump might blame them for the failure of the peace process and potentially cut off essential military support in the near future. The peace framework proposed by the U.S. in Paris the week before had raised several red flags for Kyiv. It effectively allowed Russia to retain nearly all territory it has occupied since 2014, freezing the conflict along current front lines. In exchange, Ukraine would be required to abandon its aspirations to join NATO. While the deal did contain some concessions, such as no restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian military and promises of potential future support from European nations, it notably lacked what Kyiv considers absolutely vital: a clear and binding commitment from the United States to defend Ukraine in the event of another Russian attack. This omission, to many Ukrainian officials, effectively strips the agreement of any real security value. In their view, such a deal might stop the current phase of fighting, but it opens the door for a much deadlier future conflict. Ukrainian negotiators have made it abundantly clear that symbolic gestures are not enough. Without a solid guarantee of Allied protection, particularly from the U.S., any peace treaty would be viewed as a pause rather than a true resolution. Their primary demand has remained unchanged throughout the process: an immediate and verifiable ceasefire as a foundation for future diplomacy. However, even this modest demand has not been fully embraced by the U.S. proposal. The framework allows Russian forces to remain entrenched in occupied territories, including newly annexed regions, while asking Ukraine to freeze its NATO ambitions indefinitely. The most contentious issue remains Crimea. The U.S. proposal implicitly legitimizes Russia's 2014 annexation, a move that directly contradicts both international law and the Ukrainian constitution. President Zelensky and his legal team argue that no sitting president has the constitutional authority to give up national territory under any circumstances. For Ukraine, this is not just a legal barrier, it's a matter of national identity and survival. To accept such a clause would be to concede that military force can redraw borders with impunity. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Yulia Sviridenko, spoke firmly in a recent press briefing, stating that Kyiv would not sign any document that strengthens Russia's ability to regroup and invade again. Her statement echoed a growing concern among military analysts that Russia, if given time and a break in combat, would use that breathing room to rearm, retrain, and prepare for a new offensive, possibly even larger in scale. Independent observers and regional experts largely agree that the current version of the American proposal tilts in favor of Moscow. While Washington claims the framework is designed to end hostilities and promote long-term stability, critics argue it does so by handing strategic advantages to the aggressor and placing all the burden of compromise on the victim. Meanwhile, frustration is simmering within the Trump administration. Senior officials have grown increasingly impatient with what they see as Ukraine's inflexibility, while Kyiv views the shifting tone from Washington as a sign of abandonment. These tensions are further amplified by a noticeable diplomatic retreat among key European partners. France and Germany, once vocal supporters of Ukraine, both declined to send representatives to the recent London Peace Summit, an absence interpreted by many as symbolic of waning European resolve. Despite these setbacks, the summit did proceed with limited participation. U.S. envoy Kif Killoger engaged in several hours of closed-door meetings with Ukrainian officials and the British Defense Minister. However, Steve Witow's absence from the summit was notable. Instead, he traveled to Moscow for a separate round of discussions with Russian President Vladimir Putin, marking their fourth meeting this year. The optics alone sent a troubling message to Kyiv, reinforcing fears that Washington may be recalibrating its loyalties. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had previously expressed optimism that a deal was within reach, but in a recent televised interview, he struck a more cautious tone. "We are closer than ever, but there are still significant gaps," he admitted. Sources close to the negotiations confirm that while the proposal is more structured than earlier attempts, it remains one-sided and lacks enforceable protections for Ukraine. Still, the deal is not without symbolic value. It introduces the possibility of a European peacekeeping mission, even though Russia has voiced strong objections to any foreign troops on Ukrainian soil. Moreover, it allows Ukraine to continue developing its military capacity without artificial restrictions, something seen as a small victory by some in Zelensky's cabinet. More ambitious discussions are now underway between the United Kingdom, France, and the United States to create a tripartite security force that would deploy following a ceasefire. The concept, however, is still in its infancy. London and Paris have made their conditions clear. They will only join the mission if the United States provides essential logistical support and aerial surveillance. So far, the Trump administration has not offered a definitive answer, creating further uncertainty about the West's long-term commitment. Instead, President Trump has floated an unconventional alternative, using American economic investment, particularly in Ukraine's mining and energy sectors, as a form of indirect security guarantee. While this strategy may boost the Ukrainian economy, critics argue that money cannot replace boots on the ground or missile defense systems. Economic ties, they say, offer little deterrence against tanks and cruise missiles. The stalled negotiations now reflect more than a breakdown in diplomacy. They expose deep ideological divides within the Western alliance, challenge the coherence of NATO's strategic goals, and reveal the increasingly transactional nature of modern geopolitics. Ukraine, left in the middle, must now navigate a dangerous path between survival and sovereignty, while global powers debate terms on conference tables far from the battlefield. As Trump pushes for a deal that promises quick closure and economic incentives, Zelensky remains locked in a struggle to defend not only his country's territory but also its right to exist on its own terms. The dream of peace has never felt more elusive. And with every passing day, the cost of delay grows heavier. This was GeoWar News. Stay informed, stay sharp.